This is your host, Dan Zapasky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. In 1985, the Night Stalker held the city of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and the entire state of California in a grip of fear and panic unparalleled in the annals of crime history. Dressed in all black, the Night Stalker entered people's homes in the dead of night, raping, shooting, stabbing, beating, and robbing helpless victims, all the while pronouncing his allegiance to Satan, even drawing a pentagram on one of his victims' bodies. Two dedicated homicide detectives joined forces in the manhunt for a satanic serial killer. One detective had brought to justice the notorious Hillside Stranglers, and another who had early on connected the many crimes in the Los Angeles area to just one serial killer. 19 victims later, and the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez is captured by an angry mob after Ramirez's photo appears on every newspaper front page and every television broadcast everywhere in the U.S. and the world. My very special guest journalist and best-selling author Philip Carlo contacted Ramirez in prison after he was convicted and wound up extensively interviewing the notorious serial killer in order to write his true crime masterpiece, The Night Stalker, The Life and Crimes of Richard Ramirez. I want to welcome to the program Mr. Philip Carlo. We have Philip Carlo here right now. We're going to put him on. We've got a bit of a technical problem here. If you can just bear with me. I apologize for the delay. There's been a technical problem here, and I'm not the most technical person. So we'll be on air in a minute here. Back with Philip Carlo, the incredible true crime masterpiece, The Night Stalker, The Life and Crimes of Richard Ramirez. We're going to be talking to Mr. Philip Carlo from his home in New York, and he's been kind enough to join us this evening, take out from his busy schedule. Good evening, Phil.
Dan, how are you?
Oh, fine, thank you. Thank you very much for joining the program. We had a little bit of a technical problem just getting you on air here. I apologize.
Not a problem. I kind of felt bad. I heard you starting to talk in circles, and I was feeling terrible. But here I am.
Right. Well, I just did an intro for the book itself, which is customary in what I do, and then I, of course, get the person that's responsible for this masterpiece, yourself, to really explain the story behind this book, this incredible book.
Well, Dan, let me first say thank you for your very kind words. They're much appreciated.
Well, let me tell you that since it comes right from the heart, because I'm telling you, I've been reading a lot of these books in the last bunch of years. It's not the only thing I read, but some of these books are just, like your book is such a masterpiece. You draw people into the story so much by providing such incredible detail through the extensive research that you've done, that you suck people into the entire story. And it's an incredible story, The Night Stalker. Now, let's start off with some questions now. You have included in your 10th anniversary edition of your book exactly what the circumstances were surrounding your decision to write this story. Please tell us the turn of events which enabled you to have this opportunity to tell this incredible story.
Well, to make a long story short, I had written a novel about abducted children who were being used in white slavery, child pornography, and whatnot. It was called Stolen Flower. As a result of that book, I became very embroiled in the issue of child sexual abuse. And this was 1986, way before the hue and cry about just how really bad it was had even begun.
Right.
And I learned that the depth and severity of how children were being abused played into, certainly, and to a degree, obviously, what they became as adults. And often, a severely abused child becomes an aggressive individual. And often, when the depth of the abuse is so severe and hurtful that it becomes almost like being branded on the brain and the libido. So I was looking for a story that would indicate the arc of how an abused child could turn into a monster. I should say a severely abused child. And I started writing men on death row, looking for links, trying to get a handle on the hardcore realities of those things happening. And I ultimately wrote Richard Ramirez at San Quentin's death row. He responded. I flew out to San Francisco and I met him at San Quentin, and I was very surprised by his demeanor. He was far more normal, and to a degree, almost too normal. Very polite, sharp, nothing like I expected. And he agreed to tell me the truth about his whole life. And I ended up spending 3 years, basically, working on that book, interviewing him, interviewing the police, victims, his mother, his brothers, his family, always looking for what links there were to what he became. And I'm saying this more as an author. My intention in the book was not to try to say A happens or B happens, so C happened, etc.
Right.
I told the story just the way it really happened. And the things that were in his childhood that might have contributed to what he became, I just wrote about and left it up to the reader to make up their mind. And I made it my business to stay right in the middle of the road, not condemning, not advocating, nor ever pontificating. And the book became, to a degree, a classic.
Absolutely.
And I say this in all modesty because I never thought that would happen. I had no understanding, no expectation about how that book would be received, etc. And now it's in its 24th printing. And of all the true crime books ever written, number one is Truman Capote's In Cold Blood.
Right.
And number two is The Night Stalker.
Really? Wow. I knew it was up there. I thought, yeah, well, it's one of the classics, including the Manson murders by Bela Lugosi.
Yeah, I know. It was a very popular book. But The Night Stalker pulled ahead of that, and I think it's because of the severity of what he did and the fact that he did it himself. Charlie Manson didn't kill anybody.
That's right.
He was basically a puppet master.
Mm-hmm.
He was a pimp. And he used the power over women and his manipulation over them to do his biddings rather than turn them out in the street as a normal pimp does. And so, to a degree, the fact that he wasn't, for want of a better way to put it, hands-on, lessened the intensity and the severity of the drama inherent in the Night Stalker case, in the Night Stalker crimes. Dan, we're talking about an individual who's coming into people's windows between 12 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, knowing that then people are in their deepest sleep, and always wearing black. Black hat, black shoes, black socks, so he could blend in with shadows. So if he stood in the dark 10 feet away from you, you didn't see him. And that's when it takes on a whole new complexion.
Absolutely.
He was like a predatory cat, a large black panther that learned how to stand and walk about on 2 feet.
Now, Phil, let's go back to the beginning a little bit, to this incredible story. And who was Richard Ramirez? What was his early life like? His childhood growing up? What were his parents really like? Where did he grow up? And after that, we can talk about Richard's cousin and the profound influence he had on Richard at age 11. But let's first go back to the beginning a little bit. What were Richard Ramirez? You talk about that you wanted to research the background of these people to see how it related, not to say cause and effect, but at least to see how it was related, how dysfunctional and what its contribution was to the end result of Richard Ramirez.
Right.
Tell us about Richard Ramirez, please.
Richard was born to hard-working lower middle class people. He was the youngest of 5 children, brought up in a reasonably good neighborhood in El Paso, Texas. His father was a policeman in Juarez, Mexico. And the family migrated to El Paso and had 5 children. Well, there were 5 children. It seems as they were hyper-religious, went to church every Sunday, and they were good, God-fearing, very honest people.
Right.
And the only thing abnormal about the father, as such, was the fact that he had a very bad temper. So bad, when he got angry, he would break things to pieces. He'd bang his head against the wall until he bled. And he had 4 sons. And when they were bad, he beat them. And he beat them severely. Not out of any particular sadism or malice. He was doing what had been done to him.
Right.
He believed in corporal punishment, used it on a regular basis. Richard, being the youngest, often saw his father beating up on his brothers. And if his father's wrath turned on him, he'd run out of the house. When he was about 9, 10 years old, he started sleeping in a cemetery a block away from the house. And he told me that he found peace and solace in the cemetery. Already there's like something is turning inside him in the wrong direction.
Right.
Most boys that age would be frightened to go to the cemetery at night.
Sure.
He wasn't. So ultimately, it was this scenario. His mom and dad went to work every day. He was alone a lot. One of his oldest brothers brought home a teacher who was supposed to be tutoring him, and he turned out to be a pedophile, and he sexually abused Richard Older's brother, and Richard's older brother told me this, and he was not really admitting to anything or ashamed of it. He was telling me very matter-of-factly. I distinctly remember he said he wanted to suck my dick, so I let him suck my dick. And I said to him, well, what was he near Richard? Did he abuse Richard? He said, I don't know. So this was kind of an interesting. A red light went off, and later I asked Richard about him, and he wouldn't admit to me what had happened. But Richard was a particularly good-looking child. He looked like a girl, beautiful actually. So knowing that, I couldn't imagine that this interaction happened, and I'm sure your listeners, some of your listeners are saying, well, so what? A lot of people are sexually abused and they don't turn into serial killers. And I'm not contending here that was remotely a contributing factor to what he became. It's just, in my mind, a kind of bump in the road. And
well, it didn't help, certainly, and now we're going to segue basically into what happened when he was 11 years old, because I think that, just like you say, a lot of people say, well, they've been abused, but what happened when he was 11 years old, I've never heard happen to anyone, and it's particularly disturbing. So could you tell our audience what happened when he was 11 with his cousin Mike?
Well, first off, I have to prefix what I'm going to say with the fact that I know it is absolutely true, and Richard did not initially tell me about this. Other family members did.
Okay.
And when I asked him about it, he admitted to it. Basically, he had a cousin that joined up to fight in Vietnam. He wanted to fight. He wanted to kill people. He was that one in every 20,000 men who enjoy war, who enjoy killing. And while he was in Vietnam, he took to turning his wrath on VC women and girls. And he would capture them via different scenarios and always took them into the jungle, bound them to a tree, severely sexually abused them, and killed them. He cut off their heads, cut off their ears, he eviscerated them. He then took photographs of his handiwork.
Wow.
And after a time, he had this terrible collection of what he was doing to women and girls. He was also taking families, mothers with two daughters, killing them in front of each other. Barbaric. And he took body parts and he saved them.
Wow.
When he returned from Vietnam, he had a box full of photographs and ears. A lot of ears. Richard was about 11 at this point. And when Mike returned, there was a big party. He was greeted as a hero. Music, food, dancing. And in reality, he was a hero. He had nothing but medals on his chest. Richard was in awe, wide-eyed, admiring Cousin Mike. And Mike smoked pot, didn't want to go back to work. He was filled with all these demons. And because he wasn't working, Richard started hanging out with him a lot. And they drive around his car, smoking pot, and Mike began regaling the boy with what he did in detail. And wide-eyed, his jaw hung open. Richard listened. And what his cousin was telling him had an effect. And he started thinking of these things and masturbating because of the fact that it was laced with sexuality, domination. I'm the boss. And Mike showed Richard the pictures. And that had a very, very bad effect on Richard. He seemed perfectly normal, but there were suddenly demons. Very, very unhealthy images in his head. And then Mike started taking Richard hunting at night in the desert surrounding El Paso. And he taught the boy how to kill, how to be invisible, how to wear black and blend into the darkness. He taught the boy where to put a bullet for the maximum effect right above the ear. He taught the boy something called a stab slash wound, which essentially is driving the blade of a knife into the side of the neck and pulling it across to the other side, thus not only cutting the throat, but to cut it with arteries. Always lethal. And little by little, something terrible was evolving inside of Richard. And he began doing burglaries.
At what age, Phil?
Oh, what I just described went from about 11 to 12 and a half, 13, and then the burglaries began.
Oh, early.
There it is. And the burglaries were very interesting because essentially he was almost going to a school to learn how to quietly get inside and outside of people's homes while they're sleeping. And through practice and repetition, he became a very good cat burglar, which later on played largely into what he became, and why he was so damn good at it. So now he's about 14, and he's in Mike's house one day, and Mike had two boys there, two sons, 4 and 6. He was married to a woman named Jessie, a particularly attractive redhead. Jessie came home carrying packages about 4 in the afternoon. And as soon as she walked in the door, she started berating Mike for not working, for not getting a job, stop smoking pot, when the hell are you going to go to work, etc. Now, in reality, Mike should have more than likely been in a psychiatric home.
Right.
But he wasn't. And he said to her, "You don't shut up, I'll kill you." And she got all, "Oh yeah? Mr. Big Shot, you're going to kill me? She's so tough." And he quietly got up. Richard is sitting there. Went to the refrigerator, opened the freezer, and took out a .38 Smith & Wesson. He kept the gun in there because he liked to keep it cool, he told Richard. He walked 2 steps to his wife, shot her square in the forehead. A finger of blood squirted from the wound. But she went down. She was dead before she hit the ground. And there she lied, with blood squirting out of her head.
Incredible.
And this is what Richard saw. And
Sure.
it gets worse. Because Mike said, "Look, Richie, go. Don't tell anybody you saw this. You never saw this." And Richard left dumbfounded. And he walked home dumbfounded. And he never told anybody, just like Mike told him. And until I got involved, many years later, his family didn't even know he was there that day. Mike called the police. He was arrested, sent to a psychiatric hospital in Texas, stayed there 4 years, and he was released. And by the time he got out, Richard was 18, and Richard saw something. He saw that you can get away with murder, literally. If he didn't consciously think about it that way, it certainly affected his subconscious. You can kill, and it's okay. When I found all this out, Richard told me about that day. I said to him, "What was it like for you? What did you see?" And he said, he saw it all in slow motion, and that he'll never forget the smell of her blood. Well, Dan, I can only say this planted a seed in Richard that grew into the Night Stalker ultimately. And about 18, 19, he got fed up with Texas, fed up with El Paso. Mike became a junkie, and they drifted apart. Richard got on a Greyhound bus, and he went to Los Angeles. He told me, looking for my pot of gold, but I found a pot of blood. And that was the beginning of one of the most horrific serial killer cases in American history.
What happened with the first murder? We won't go through all of them, but what happened with the first murder? When did he turn suddenly from burglar to rapist to killer? Tell us about the Night Stalker's first strike. What was his M.O. and what was his signature? What unique things characterized his behavior during the commission of his crimes?
Well, Dan, that's a very good question. And it's a rather complicated answer because the first murder that he was charged with, the killing of an 82-year-old woman named Jenny Venka in Los Angeles, was not the first murder he committed. Richard was convicted of 14 murders, but I know for a fact he killed over 40 people. When he was in El Paso, he came into a home one day, and he thought it was empty, but somebody was sleeping. They got into a tussle, and that person was dead. And he didn't feel any remorse or guilt. He felt instead powerful, omnipotent. Can I curse?
Sure.
Fuck with me and you're dead. Resonated in his head. I control who lives and who dies. And he started carrying a gun. And whenever he was confronted, it was a very simple answer. Kill the person. And he killed and killed and killed. In El Paso and in every state between El Paso and Los Angeles, he killed people. And the whole thing with rape. What happened with Mike? Those photographs. He was a full-blown sexual degenerate, sexual sadist, obsessed with sex. He, in his cell, cellmates and guards told me he would masturbate constantly. I know this is like weird, and I don't particularly enjoy saying it. I don't particularly think it means anything one way or another, but this is what the creature is.
Exactly.
I'm sick and tired of people talking around the truth and trying to either hang carnations on it or make it something like we see in Friday the 13th, or just gratuitous nonsense and violence.
Yes.
And if there was a woman there, he raped her. He tied her up. He bound her up. He did exactly what his cousin taught him without meaning to teach him anything. And it got worse and worse and worse. To one woman, it was the 6th incident that he was charged with. The Zazaras, a lovely couple that lived in Whittier. Beautiful home. Mr. Zazara owned 4 pizza places. They were enjoying life, and he went in the back window, killed Mrs. Zazara, killed her, raped her, and he cut out her eyes. He took both her eyes out of her head. And he did it in a way that was rather telling. He used a spoon to do it. And
why is that telling?
Because he did it before. But we don't know about that. He didn't tell me about it. But it showed a certain amount of expertise. And later, when we talked about that, he said that if you take the eyes of someone, you have their soul. That, I think, was in the back of his head. And I said, what happened to that woman's eyes? And he wouldn't tell me. But I later found out that he mailed the eyes to his father. I don't know what Sigmund Freud would make of that. But
he'd be baffled.
And I don't know what to make of it. Certainly, but it happened. And it was very unusual.
Now, Phil, there were victims that were killed and others that were spared.
Right.
What did those surviving victims say was the reason they felt that their lives were spared?
Well, the truth of the matter is, the people, the woman that acquiesced to his demands,
Right.
were brutally raped, sodomized in every way imaginable, but weren't killed. It's the woman that resisted him, screamed and yelled and cursed at him. He not only killed, but he brutalized him.
Right.
One woman in Monterey Park, she was fighting him. He's walking up the block, walking in shadows. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, and he sees this home. It's only a ranch-style type home. You know, and a woman is falling asleep on a couch while watching television. How many times has that happened to you, to the people listening?
Right.
And so, this is one of the reasons that makes his crime so disconcerting. He sees her. He boldly walks across the yard, tries the front window. It opens. He steps in, attacks the woman. She puts up a fight for a brief moment, and he beat her down, and he kept beating her until she was dead. And he kicked her in the face so hard that it kept a permanent the bottom of his shoe and a via was stamped into her face. And hours later, that morning actually, when the police came, that the bottom of that sole imprint was on her face. I'm saying this just to give listeners an idea of the terrible depth and severity of what was going on, what he did. And it's very bad. Yet, I'm sitting with him on death row, and you wouldn't know it. You just wouldn't know it. And in a way, these two aspects, the severe violence and the depravity, versus this polite man sitting in front of me, asking me polite questions, and thinking something's wrong here. And then when I started looking at it closer and closer, I realized that when I say it, I don't mean only Richard. I mean the mold that he came from.
Right.
From Jack the Ripper to Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Boston Strangler. They all have one thing in common. When you look at them, you never know what's inside of them. They seem like the nice guy next door. That's this dichotomy is, I think, to a degree, what draws me to wanting to write about these individuals, because there's an ongoing pathology of murder that is done in such a way where it's extremely well thought out and planned. They're like jungle creatures that are at the top of the food chain.
Right.
And they're killers. predators, but you don't know it. You look and you don't see anything. And that's, it's like a person that gets angry, gets into a fight, an argument over something, and loses their temper for a minute and kills somebody. That's one thing. But some thinking about it and planning it and going out, but having to do it so badly that it's like food to a starving man, water to someone dying of thirst. That's what a serial killer really is. And anyone that says anything else is ill-informed or lying.
Yeah, they're a rare breed, the psychopathic killer, but they're out there, and they're very charming. I wanted to ask you, one of the things that the victims, in your book you talk about, that Ramirez forced his victims to pledge allegiance to Satan. And he did draw a pentagram on one of the victims' bodies, as I mentioned in the introduction, and drew a pentagram at one of the crime scenes, or more than one of the crime scenes. So pentagram and Satanism, his hat with the AC/DC logo was found. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the satanic element that was involved with Richard Ramirez and these crimes.
Absolutely. Well, the truth of the matter is, his mother was hyper-religious, and which is the boy, dragged into church every Sunday. So he was very exposed to the Catholic Church, the Mass, the candles, the Latin, the communication, all those elements. And after his incident with Mike, and he began thinking sadistic thoughts involving sexuality and rape and women, he realized that Jesus Christ was not for him. Though he was religious, he did believe in God. He did believe in Jesus. And when he turned away from the preaching of Jesus, he was looking at something else. He was looking at the opposite pole. He was looking at Satan. And because he believed wholeheartedly in Christ, as it were, he believed in Satan. And ultimately, he embraced Satan. And with that, any semblance of morality he still had went out the window. And he started reading up on Satan. He went to San Francisco from El Paso to meet with Anton LaVey, who was the head of the Church of Satan.
Right.
And the dictate essentially was, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. And with that, he was guiltless. He believed that whatever bad he did would please Satan. He believed for real that ultimately he would be at the table of Satan and have a place of honor. And he not only embraced this, but he lived it. As an example, one day when I was interviewing him, he sneezed. And I said, God bless you. He said, don't say that.
Don't say.
Say, Satan bless you. I said, okay, Richard. Satan bless you. But on the more serious side, he started leaving pentagrams at crime scenes in blood on the wall and carved into the bodies of some victims. And he did this because he was telling the world, I am of Satan. I love evil. What is the reverse of evil? It's live. And like this, he lived, and he then was unstoppable. He believed he had the power of the devil behind him. And you can't, some people said, well, he just made that up as some kind of gimmick during his trial. But that's not true. He really does believe in Satan, and it came about the way I just described it.
Right.
Essentially.
He's the ultimate outsider, so he thinks Satan, if he doesn't have any affinity with God or Christ, he's the ultimate outsider, picking Satan.
Exactly.
Now, in this manhunt that is going on to try to find the Night Stalker, we do have that enter into your story two very, very strong characters and very important to you being able to tell the story, and very important central figures in this, and that a couple of detectives homicide detectives named Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno. And Salerno, like you mentioned in your book, his fame comes from being involved with the Hillside Stranglers. Tell us a little bit about Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo and their role in this manhunt.
Well, you described that, Dan, very accurately. Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno were the guys that headed the Night Stalker task force. They worked tirelessly to try to solve this case, try to stop the killings. And Frank Salerno was a legend in homicide in LA. He ran the Hillside Strangler task force, and he ran the Night Stalker task force. And ultimately, because of their dogged, plain old hard work, they ended up finding the thread that ultimately solved the case, identified Richard, and they were able to get him. But Frank Salerno is one of all the people I've met in the world, I respect him the most. He's one of the nicest people I ever met. He was very hard to get close to. Initially, he didn't want nothing to do with me. But I managed to have a lunch with him, and from there we got closer and closer. And ultimately, he brought me to his home, and I met his whole family. And he really is what made America great. He just has all the attributes. His mother had 26 brothers and sisters from a huge Italian family.
Huge.
And just a decent individual, as tough as a rusted nail. And Gil Carrillo was 6'6", 300-pound Mexican man, also the salt of the earth. And they would not rest until they stopped these killings, these rapes, just arbitrarily, senseless crimes. And I think it affected them both in a negative way, because it was just too much, so much, and so brutal. But I can say that both of them are retired and well, and really enjoying life.
You know what I thought was fascinating in your book? You talk about close to home for these people that are living and breathing this manhunt for this vicious serial killer. Is that Gil Carrillo has to move his family out of his house because the Night Stalker is coming to a neighborhood close nearby. incredible how the fear in the city, how you describe the fear that paralyzed that city, and yet still the Night Stalker was getting in through windows and doing his dastardly deeds.
Absolutely. It got so that gun shops, when the owners showed up in the morning, they'd find a line, a block long, people buying guns because of the stalker. Guard dogs. Every guard dog in California was sold. They had to bring more dogs in out of the state. Locksmiths were working 24 hours a day, overtime, putting in alarms and different ways to identify an intruder. And there were essentially 13 million people living in Los Angeles County. And this guy and what he did affected everybody. But fathers would not allow their daughters out. Husbands wanted their wives home early. In 101-degree weather, people were locking their windows. They were so afraid this monster would creep into their windows. And he did. Because with all this, with all these cops looking for him, with all these people with guns, it didn't stop him. He continued and continued and continued.
He even went to San Francisco and committed some more murders.
When it got too hot in L.A., he split and went to San Francisco and killed people there and drew a pentagram on his victim's body in San Francisco. And that was the whole thing. It just didn't stop, and it was everywhere. He used the L.A. freeway system to do this. You could go from one city to another, back and forth, up and down. And he did. He'd go north, then he'd go south. Then he'd go east, then he'd go west. And if you look on the map and see the pattern, there was no pattern. It was all over the place.
Yeah.
He wrought havoc wherever he went. But then, finally,
how exactly did they get word of who this was? Tell us who the hero or the unlikely hero is in basically notifying the police and giving them a name.
Well, again, long story short, he went further than he normally, than the areas he normally hit. He went to Sierra Madre, and he broke into a home, attacked a couple, raped a woman, told her, "Tell me you love Satan, swear on Satan." And he did really say that to her. And of course she had to say it. And he raped her. As he was leaving, a young boy that was up late because he got a new bicycle, and he was in the garage shining his bike, looked up, and Richard drove by. And at that point, there were sketches on the front page of every paper about what the Night Stalker looked like. And the boy thought, a 14-year-old boy, that's the stalker. And he had the wherewithal to run out in the street and get the plate number.
Wow.
Then back to the garage, wrote it on the wall, and kind of forgot about it. Until later that morning, there were police everywhere. And the word went up and down, all around the neighborhood, like jungle drums. The stalker struck. And the boy told his father. Father told the cop. They got the license plate. And So they knew now the car he was driving. When he left that city that night, she drove back to L.A. proper, left the car in a parking lot. It was a very hot night. And after the crime, he was very sweating, and he had gloves on. He always had gloves on.
Right.
That was one of the reasons why his reign of terror lasted so long. But he took off the gloves because of the heat, and as he's driving away, he's on the freeway. He adjusted the rearview mirror, and he left one fingerprint on the far side of the mirror. Got to the parking lot, took the gloves carefully, wiped down everything, but he didn't wipe the back of the mirror. Later that day, well, actually, the next day, cops everywhere were looking for that car. It was an orange Toyota. The car was spotted in a parking lot. They took it to a police lab, basically, and they looked all day and all night. They found nothing. When they were just about ready to give up, a female lab technician turned that mirror around, dusted it, and lo and behold, there was a print. Well, they took that print and they put it in a new system, a computer, and only 10,000 prints had been inputted so far out of many millions of prints on file throughout LA County. But somehow, perhaps Satan turned his back on Richard. One of those 10,000 prints was Richard Ramirez. And bang, it popped right up. They had a name, and they had a face, and soon that photograph was a mugshot from a car burglary incident that had happened 2 years earlier. It was everywhere. And it didn't take long for the stalker to be ID'd in the street, and he was nearly beaten to death by the citizens of Hubbard Street. How's this for irony? It was the cops that saved Richard's life.
Yeah.
They were going to kill him.
Sure.
Everybody was incensed. And all that anger, all that pent-up anger poured out of them. And they were stomping him and beating him and hitting him. Another minute, he would have been beaten into the ground, dead. But the cops pulled up, saved him. And that ended the terror. But a whole new saga began. And it even becomes more bizarre.
It really does. Phil, we're going to have to wrap up now. It's been a short hour. I want to thank you very much, and I want to implore people, go out, find it, Philip Carlo, The Night Stalker on Pinnacle. It's been very good talking to you this evening. I want to thank you very much for your generous output of time to be able to do this interview. I want you to have a great night, and thank you for a great interview, Phil.
Thank you. Be well.
Take care. Good night. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors have written about them. Good night.